First, do I give the welcome or somebody else doing the welcome?
I think you do.
Okay, I do the welcome after. So I'm Mike Harris. I have the great honor and pleasure of serving as the president of the board of Mimosa, and our team is excited about this talk tonight because it speaks to something that we all care deeply about, uh, Mimosa Hall and Gardens. And Sarah has given this tour many times, and this talk many times, but I think every time it gets better. So we're excited to have her here. So let me tell you, so one, thank you for attending. Thank you for reserving the time and being here with us. And we hope to have you on the property one day soon. Uh, but for now, Dr. Sarah Harwood, who is going to do this talk today, is an English professor at Clayton State University. She earned her PhD in English at Georgia State University, where her dissertation examined a 17th century Bible commentary written by Cotton Mather. She earned her master's and bachelor's degrees in history, and her current research focuses on public memory, heritage preservation, and interpretation of historic sites. Her study of slavery at Bullock Hall, which she presented to the Society of Early Americanists earlier this month, will be published in a collection of essays by Routledge later this year. Sarah has been on the board of the Friends of Mimosa since 2017. She is a preservationist, a conservationist, a historian, an amazing writer, a great source and resource for all of us here in Roswell. We're glad she's here. So thank you, Sarah. We're so glad you're here and making this presentation today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. And thank you everyone for joining us. So I'm going to go ahead and maximize the screen so that you can see this presentation. Which is in Prezi form. So hopefully Prezi will work for us today. So we're talking about Mimosa Hall. I'm going to give you, first of all, a little tour of Mimosa Hall and the grounds, especially for those of you who haven't been inside. You will be in person soon, but for right now, we have to go virtual. So I'll give a little tour of the house and property, and then I'll talk about the history of the property. And if you have any questions as I'm going through this presentation, please put them in the chat box or write it down, and we'll have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. Thanks. So we're looking at the outside of the house right now. For those of you who aren't familiar with where it is, it's in downtown Roswell, which is just outside of Atlanta. It's a bit north. Roswell is its own separate community though, and this is near the historic downtown. So we're looking at the outside of the house right now, and now we're going to go through so that you can see what the inside of the house looks like. Okay, so we're looking at the front of the house, classic Greek Revival. And now we've just gone in the front door, so you can see the front hallway. Yes, real marble floors and wallpaper framed. We'll talk about that later when I talk about the history of the house. But you see that we have this central entranceway, and then going to the left. And at the left side of the house, there is what used to be two separate parlor rooms that were combined and are now one big double parlor. And these photos, by the way, come from Sotheby's from when the home was on sale in 2017. So the house looks a little bit different now. The furniture is not there. And of course, it's in the process of being restored so that it can open to the public soon. So it doesn't look lived in just right now, but it's going to look just as beautiful, if not more beautiful, very soon. So double parlor, and then if you were to go through this door back here, there's actually a wet bar and then a kitchen beside it. Kitchen with cabinets said to have been designed by Neil Reed. I'll talk about Neil Reed in a few minutes. So we're going to go backwards now. I just wanted to show you the kitchen so you know what's back behind the door. So now we're back in the front hallway. And now we're going to go to the right. And at the right, we have a library. The bookshelves are built in. We actually do have books that were donated by the last owner. The furniture itself is not there right now, but we do actually have books, so it still looks like a library. If you were to turn around, do a complete 180 turn, this is what you'll see. So these doors, possibly 18th century, but were imported and brought to be put in the house, probably sold at auction to later owners of the house, who I'll talk about later on in the presentation. And when you look through those doors, you're looking into the dining room. And then back behind this door is that kitchen. So the kitchen kind of stretches behind the back of the house. There's also a back stairway. So now we're going to turn around and go back to the front hall, because we're going to go upstairs. So now we're going to head up this front staircase. So this is where the back staircase goes that I just mentioned, that leads down to the kitchen, but the staircase winds around. And then upstairs, there are actually 4 bedrooms. We'll just take a look at 2 of them. We do still have the wallpaper, but the wallpaper, unfortunately, is not in great condition. So I'm not sure if it's going to be restored or not. What's really interesting, and I don't unfortunately have photos of it, is that these bedrooms upstairs were built to have closets, which is actually pretty amazing and unusual for an antebellum home. So the house was built about 1840, and I'll talk about that a little later, but at that time, houses weren't built with closets. People would put their clothes in wardrobes, but this one was built with original closets. Those closets are still there. In 2 of the rooms, the closets are still closets. In 2 of them, they were converted into bathrooms, very likely by Neil Reed in the 1920s. Now we'll go across the hall, look at one of the other bedrooms. So you can see they're really spacious rooms. Going back to staircase, now we're just going to go to the back door. There's a little patio back there. So this little patio looks out onto the garden, and we'll go through the garden next. Okay, so that's our tour of the inside of the house. We didn't go to the basement. The basement is actually a really fascinating area too. There's an original hearth down in the basement that was built with the house, which is actually another anomaly with this house. Not normal to have closets, not normal to have a kitchen in the house in a Southern home, but this is the original kitchen. We don't believe there was ever an external kitchen. It seems that the kitchen was actually part of the building right from the beginning. There's a staircase behind that back staircase that we saw that leads down to that basement room where there's the original hearth. And the staircase that's there right now is not original, but architectural evidence does indicate that originally there was a staircase right down to that room. Okay, so now we're behind the house to see the gardens. So the gardens were, this was always a big property. The original property deeded to John Dunwoody was about 10 acres, and it has changed a little bit. It has had additional property added and property taken away. So now I believe we're around 9 acres. So just about the same as it was originally when it belonged to John Dunwoody. And in the 1920s, architect Neil Reed, who owned the house, decided to install garden rooms. So he's the one who really made the gardens look the way they do. But it is important to note that later owners of the house also put their fingerprint on the gardens. They made some pretty substantial changes too. And I'm going to go ahead and plug our garden website if you want more information about the gardens. Mimosagardens.org has a whole garden tour that remarks on some of the more incredible, unique plants and trees that exist at the Mimosa Hall Gardens. But I do want to still give you a bit of a taste, let's say, of what the gardens look like. So we're looking at the back of the house. This is a little patio we just saw. And if you turn to the right, there's a parterre garden, which is a series of squares. There are 4 of them, and they're smaller gardens, boxwood bordered with different types of plants in them. Ours right now are empty, but they would have originally been planted with different types of flowers. And one of them has a vegetable garden. As you can see, there's wooden framing around it. And this is another view of the parterre. So there's that wooden framing with the vegetable garden. To your left, you would see an allée, which is big, long, tree-lined walk. The allée at Mimosa Hall actually goes next door to Bullock Hall, which is another antebellum home. The Dunwoodies were related to the Bullock family next door, so we think that the allée was put in around that time, so right when the house was first built, so that the families could walk back and forth to each other's homes. And now we're going to turn and go in the other direction. So we're going this way to the right with the house at our left. And this is an older photo, but this is what the allée looked like a couple years ago, just after the city had bought the home. They've now trimmed the grass and trimmed away a lot of the privet and all of the growth so that it looks more like the Sotheby's photo. And if you keep going down that allée, eventually you will get to this garden, the Reflecting Pool Garden, which was constructed by Neil Reed in about 1921. We got a grant, the Friends of Mimosa got a grant from Garden Club of Georgia in 2018 to have this garden restored. This one is really well documented in terms of what was originally there when Neil Reed had it planted. So we were able to restore some of the plants that he had. The boxwood had grown like crazy, and it was starting to get kind of spindly. So it was cut back and is now much healthier. And there were flowers, daylilies, that hadn't bloomed for seasons. And when we got that boxwood cut back and some of the trees trimmed, then the daylilies actually got light again and started to bloom. So this is going to be a little bit jarring, but here's a picture of what the garden looked like right when it was first planted. And of course, this is a photo from 1925, so pardon the fuzziness, but this is what it looked like. So you can see we were just standing on the other side looking at it, but this is that reflecting pool. And then the boxwood, itty bitty boxwood, just starting to grow. It was just planted, and you can see the daylilies. So when you're standing here, you're actually standing with Mimosa Hall behind you, and you're looking towards the reflecting pool, and then there's another garden back there. This garden I'll talk about in a moment. I mentioned that later owners put their fingerprint on the grounds, not always in the best way, because this is what that garden looks like now. And actually not even now because the pool was actually covered up and it's being removed. So there was a beautiful sunken rose garden on this property for about 10 years. And then in the 1930s, the next owner decided to remove it and seems to have put in a pool sometime in the 1930s. Where we're standing now, though, just so you can get a sense of perspective, you can see Mimosa Hall there. The reflecting pool garden is right up here.
It is.
And here's what it looked like in 1925. Same view, right? So here's where the garden was. That is now the pool. And of course, we have fencing put up for safety now, but this is where the reflecting pool garden is. So it's grown quite a bit and changed a little, but not too much. Okay, so that's the tour of the grounds. And again, if you want to see more of the gardens, mimosagardens.org is the place to go. But now I want to talk about the history of the property. Okay, so here's a historic photo from the 1930s taken from the HABS survey. And underneath, I just have the chronology to give you a sense of how long different people have owned the house. I am going to be structuring this talk around the different owners whose names were on the deed. The last one is Roswell, the city of Roswell. This one doesn't quite reflect the time because Roswell has owned the house since 2017. So it's a little bit bigger than you would reflect if you were really going to proportion it correctly, but it's going to belong to the city of Roswell and, you know, all of us as citizens of Roswell forever. So we can just stretch this bar all the way off the screen. You see what I mean? Okay, so now I'm going to get into a little bit more detail about who lived in the house, what was the house like, some little surprises, let's say, about the history of this property. So we're going to talk about the Dunwoody family. Yes, just one O. The son, Charles, added an extra O. Supposedly it happened by accident, that the post office made a mistake, but it started to be called Dunwoody, or spelled with two O's later, but it was always pronounced Dunwoody like this. And yes, the town of Dunwoody is also named after this family, after Charles Dunwoody, who settled in what is now Dunwoody. So the Dunwoody family owned the property from 1839 until 1869. And they were the ones who would have had the house constructed. Unfortunately, the original deed no longer exists. I haven't been able to find it, but the property would have been probably sold to John Dunwoody, perhaps by Roswell King or somebody in association with Roswell King. And it would have been Cherokee land right until 1838 and the Trail of Tears. This was part of the area that was seized during the Trail of Tears and then broken up into land grants. And so the person who won the land that is now Roswell would have likely sold it to Roswell King, who then dispersed the properties into smaller, he would have broken them into smaller properties and given them to people who invested in his mill. That's getting into the Roswell story, and I'm trying to tell the Mimosa story, so I won't elaborate, but there are a lot of great books, and we have a great archive as well in Roswell where you can learn more about that history of Roswell. Wanted to give you a bit of context for where 1839 comes from. That's when the Dunwoodies would have purchased the property, even though we don't have the original deed. But based on the 1869 deed, when they sold the house, it was 9 acres, and it seems that that original plot had always been 9 acres as long as the Dunwoodies had owned it. The Dunwoodies were planters from near Savannah, just south of Savannah in Liberty County. This is John Dunwoody and Jane Bullock Dunwoody, related, of course, to the Bullock family next door. The women in the middle are the Atwood sisters. I believe it's the one in the middle is Ruth Ann Atwood, who married the Dunwoody's son, William. They had 6 children who lived to adulthood, 5 sons and a daughter. So William is one of those sons, and Ruth is helpful because she wrote a bunch of letters, and in those letters she talks about her in-laws and a little bit about the house. So she actually helps give us a bit of context to learn about the house. So someone who worked at the mill, a man named Henry Merrill, wrote his memoirs later on. And when he wrote his memoirs, he talked about the settling of Roswell in 1839. And he mentioned that everybody, you know, while they were having their houses built, and the houses were built by slave labor, to be clear, while that was happening, the families were living in different places. And he talks about the Dunwoody family. And Merrill mentions that while the Dunwoodies were waiting for their house to be constructed, their daughter, Marion, got married, but they were still at their old house. So it's a good way to tell when were they still at their old house when they moved to this one. Well, the marriage was in early 1840. So we know that the house was still under construction, but most of it was still under construction in 1840. But as you may have heard, there's a legend that when the house was actually finished construction, they had a housewarming party, and somebody involved in the construction of the house had put some wooden planks up one of the fireplaces. And at this housewarming party, It was a chilly day. They lit a fire for the first time. The planks caught fire, the whole house caught fire, and the house burned to the ground. That's what the story says. And architectural evidence does actually support that there was some kind of fire, not that the whole house was completely gone, but it was at least hit by a fire. We don't know when, of course, but we do see burned elements in the basement that indicate there was a fire. So the house was burned at one point, probably during this original fire, and Ruth Ann helps us know when it was rebuilt because she's writing letters while living with the Dunwoodies in this house in 1844. So 1839, you might debate, is that when it, when construction first started, or would you say 1844? But at least we know by 1844 it was built and it was looking the way it does now. And just some other interesting details about the Dunwoody residence at the home. So because the house rose from the ashes, the family, they didn't call it Mimosa Hall, they called it Phoenix Hall. So it was sometimes called the Dunwoody Place, sometimes called Phoenix Hall. But what you're seeing here is a letter written by that daughter, Marion, and she's writing the letter from Phoenix Hall in 1850. And that's actually the only contemporary evidence that supports it being called Phoenix Hall. Everybody else calls it Dunwoody Hall, but we have proof it was called Phoenix Hall, at least by the daughter Marion. And then I also wanted to mention the enslaved people. So enslaved people likely employed by the carpenter who made the plans for the house, built the home, but the Dunwoody family were also enslavers while they were living at this home and also while they were in Savannah. And I am trying to research those enslaved people and where they came from. Dunwoody owned a plantation on the coast and in Liberty County, and he was one of the biggest enslavers in Liberty County. In 1820, in the census, he owned 60 people. And he moved up here to Roswell to work or be a manager in the mill. And when he moved up here, some of the enslaved people from Liberty County came with him, but not all of them. And a few years after moving up here, Dunwoody sold that plantation to a relative. And the enslaved people presumably would have been part of that sale. And yet, at any given time, while the Dunwoody family was at this property and their only property was in Roswell, they owned about 30 to 40 enslaved people. I've made a spreadsheet where I'm trying to track from the different sources that are available where these enslaved people came from, when they left, if they left, what happened. And my Excel spreadsheet has over 100 people on it. Because there just doesn't seem to be much overlap. So I'm still trying to learn more about that and figure out where they came from, if they came from the Bullock family, for example, or from another Dunwoody relative. And I can't say, but if you have questions about it, I'll be happy to answer afterwards or offline too. This walnut tree is one of the only things on the property other than the house that actually does date to when the Dunwoodies were there. This is believed to be an antebellum black walnut tree. It's huge. You can't tell from the picture. It doesn't quite dwarf the house this way, but it is actually an enormous and really majestic tree. And I always think it's incredible to reflect on what that tree would have seen in all of these years that it's been standing, 200 years. Okay, so that brings us to the next owners of the house. John Dunwoody died in 1858, and then of course the Civil War happened, and the sons decided to divide up the property that Dunwoody owned amongst themselves. And finally, in 1869, they had all moved away pretty much, so they decided to sell it, and they sold it to Andrew Jackson Hansel, who came to Roswell to manage the mill and especially to help with rebuilding the mill after the war. And so here's a picture of A.J. Hansel, and he came from Tranquilla in Marietta, which is another famous historic house. I have this little picture in the middle, which might seem kind of odd. It's a mimosa tree. This is when Mimosa Hall became Mimosa Hall. The Hansels are the ones who named it that sometime during their tenure at the house. And they named it that not because they like champagne and orange juice, but because of the mimosa trees, which I know is, we think of them as invasive and unpleasant, but at that time and in the earlier years too, non-native trees were considered, ideal and exotic. And so people liked invasive, as we would call them, trees like mimosa trees. So there were mimosa trees originally scattered around the property. As you can see, there's still one. There's more than one, but there aren't very many anymore, which I guess we should be glad of now, but the Hansels would not be glad. They would want more and more mimosas. I like more and more mimosas too, just not more referring to trees. This picture is conjectural. It was done in the 1930s, but it is showing what the property is believed to have looked like when the Hansels lived there. Now, this garden is very likely an original garden that was to the west of the house, which is just a formal decorative garden for the pleasure of the Dunwoody family. The east would have been the kitchen garden, and the Dunwoodies, and by that I do mean the Dunwoodies, not the enslaved people, but the Dunwoodies themselves had a garden to the side where they grew quince and I think peaches. So that likely would have been on this side, and the driveway would have been heart-shaped, just like at Bullock Hall next door. These two buildings back here are the slave quarters that are included in this conjectural drawing. Now, census data actually does indicate that there were 4 slave quarters at Mimosa Hall, and for 40 people, that makes more sense than just 2 slave quarters. But when the Hansel family bought the house, something kind of odd, and I can't find the explanation, I'm still researching it, but in the 1870s, A.J. Hansel sold the house to his wife, and don't know why, but he did. They stayed married, they stayed living together, living at the house, but he sold her the house and most of his residential property. And so that's one of the things that's kind of interesting and different about this house, that it belonged to Mrs. Hansel, Caroline, for the majority of the time that the Hansels were there. But in that deed, they mentioned that they actually built servants' quarters, and by servants, I mean literally paid servants. Slavery was abolished by then, but servants' quarters across the street. So like down here, if we're looking at a map. So presumably the slave quarters were no longer there if they built housing for the domestic servants. So that's something that makes this conjectural drawing all the more mysterious. Okay, and then the next owner, the King family, yes, related to Roswell King, although this is a wife who married into the King family. She was actually widowed in 1899 and bought the house right around the same time. She was the widow of Barrington King from Barrington Hall. I want to say it's Barrington King III, that she had married and was widowed by that same year. So the Hansel family had owned the house. A.J. Hansel passed away in the 1880s, and Caroline Hansel and her children continued to live at the house. And then Caroline Hansel passed away, and I don't understand why, but for some reason they decided to put it up for public auction. So the house actually would have been auctioned off on the steps. It was advertised in the newspaper, highest bidder wins. And Mrs. Ada King got very lucky. She bought it for $1850, which is $55,000 today. So yes, she got a real steal. And it was when she owned the property that the layout changed a little bit. It was a bigger property at this time. The Hansels had added some land on almost all sides, including, of course, south of it where the servants' quarters were. And she sold off little slices over the years, basically bringing it back down to the 9 acres that it is now. I'm trying to learn more about her. Just like the Hansels, she would have had a domestic servant. The census record for 1910 indicates that she had 1 cook that was living with her. The Hansels, there is no census record for 1890 for them, but They are in 1880 at the house, and they would have had 2 white domestic servants that were living on their property. So I'm trying to learn more about the servants, but the servants change actually every 10 years in all of the census records. There's no consistency there, even when the homeowners stay the same. So Mrs. King was not operating the property on her own, not trying to manage it on her own. She at least had a cook who was helping with the food, and she had children that were living with her, and different relatives got married over the years. So it was featured in newspapers because of that. However, it does seem that the house would have gone into kind of poor repair under Mrs. King's ownership. So in 1918, it was sold to Neil Reed, who is probably the most famous of the owners of the property. Neil Reed, architect, and he was from Macon, designed a lot of beautiful homes out there, and then decided to buy a home here in Roswell. He bought Mimosa Hall and made some pretty major renovations to it. So I just want to zoom in a little, show some of these pictures. So this is Hills and Dales, one of his most famous homes that he designed just a little south of here, about an hour and a half from here, near Callaway Gardens. Gorgeous home. It's a museum and it's open to the public, so I recommend taking a look. Go. And this, of course, is a picture of Neil Reed. And it's also a picture of Neil Reed and his family, his mother, on the steps of Mimosa Hall. So he made a couple changes to the inside of the house, such as installing this wallpaper. As an architect, he had gone to Europe to study, and I think he saw this wallpaper while he was there, and decided to bring it back. We still have the wallpaper. Unfortunately, there was a fire in the 1950s, different part of the house than where the damage shows, reflecting the 1840s fire, by the way. So the 1950s one is very well documented, but the 1840s one, we still have that architectural evidence. But anyway, so the fire did damage the wallpaper. So we have restored wallpaper now in the same places and looking the same as what Neil Reed had put in the walls. He also is the one who decided to break those 2 smaller parlors at the front of the house into one big double parlor. And this is one of those gardens. This is actually where the pool is now, the big swimming pool. Supposedly he actually found this little fountain on the property and decided to work it into the garden. That is no longer there, but it was said at the time that it actually dated to the time of the Dunwoodies. And I want to show you the front hallway, because this is what the front hallway looked like when Neil Reed was there. So of course you see the wallpaper that he installed. But if you look at the floor, you can see it's wooden floor. For the longest time, I thought that Neil Reed was the one who would put in the marble floors, but nope, because probably the marble floors were actually put in by later owners after that 1950s fire. If the wallpaper was damaged, then likely the floors were too. So that's probably when those marble floors were put in. They're probably 1958 or 1959. Another thing that's kind of curious, if you remember back when we saw the hallway, there's a door right there. Don't know when that door was installed, but there was no door when Neil Reed was there. So that's something that would have changed sometime since Neil Reed lived there. Now, Neil Reed passed away in 1926, but his mother and his sister continued to live at the house, and those gardens have become so famous that garden clubs were coming from all over to tour the house. And Mrs. Reed and her daughter, Louisa, decided to open a tea kitchen. So they would offer public teas and sort of cater events at the house, very likely in that double parlor. So this is when there started to be a lot of press for Mimosa Hall, and there are more photos, there's more documentation of what the house looked like, and especially what the gardens looked like. And then in 1937, Mrs. Reed decided that she wanted to downsize, and so she and Louisa decided to sell the house, and they sold it to Gus Tolson, who was a cotton broker in New York City. And he reigned in New York City the whole time that he owned the house. He only owned it for about 10 years. So in that time, he used it as like his weekend place and would have flown up on weekends to come and see Mimosa Hall, especially in the summer. It seems to have been his mom who was coming and actually living at the house full time. And as you can see, he also got a steal when he bought the house, $22,000, $390,000 today. There are some pictures from this time, but it's not a very well documented time, partly because Tolson himself wasn't actually really living there. There's an old grist mill on the property that's a 19th century grist mill, but not original to the property. I believe it would have been brought in by Tolson, probably to be a barn because he had ponies as well as dogs. So it's possible that he brought that in at that time. There is no documentation that I've found yet referring to this barn and when it came. I just know that he needed to put his ponies somewhere. And he is the one who took out that beautiful garden that Neil Reed had installed and put in the swimming pool. And then after Tolson, actually it was Mrs. Tolson, Gus Tolson's mother, Jean, decided to move back to her native New Orleans, and Tolson sold the house since he was, of course, living in New York. So they sold it to the Hansel family. These are direct descendants of A.J. Hansel, who had owned the house, and Caroline Hansel, who had owned the house in the 19th century. So a couple generations later, the Hansels decided to buy the house again. And something that's kind of interesting, keeping, I guess, in the tradition of the first Hansels who were there, it was Mrs. Hansel, Sarah Bell, who bought the house, not Mr. Hansel, Granger Hansel. So it was actually Sarah Bell who purchased the house in 1947 and continued to own it. And the Hansels were very interested in art. They were among the founders of the High Museum. So they were not only featured in a lot of magazines like Life magazine. This photo comes from Life magazine. They were also in called the Most Beautiful Rooms in America. So again, the house was getting more press, but they also had celebrities come and stay with them. So they had opera singers come from the Met, and that's what you're seeing in this picture. This, of course, is the back patio that I showed you a few minutes ago, where you can see out onto the garden and to the well house. And I'm afraid I cannot tell you who these famous opera singers are. I'm not a follower of opera in the 1960s, but at the time that would have meant a lot to people who followed opera. And this, of course, is Granger. This picture, very fuzzy, is one that was taken after the fire. So the fire in 1958 seems that the house was struck by lightning, and that is what led to a lot of damage on the east side of the house, the side that has the library. So the library was actually rebuilt. This side, the double parlor side, was untouched, but the library and the front lobby were damaged and essentially rebuilt. And also a picture of one of the servants who was a longtime worker at the property, John Lewis Cook. There was also a woman named Dora, I've learned from descendants, and I'm trying to research them. I know that they were both from Roswell, and they didn't live at the house. They lived separately in the Pleasant Grove area. But they were the ones who would have done a lot of the gardening. Granger Hansel also did a lot of the gardening, and they also would have helped with running events, doing the cooking for the family too. And then in 2017, the city of Roswell purchased the house from the latest generation of Hansels. This is Sally Hansel, the last private owner of the house, with 2 members of the board from Friends of Mimosa. And now, of course, it belongs to the city of Roswell, and we've got a lot of interesting things going on. What you're seeing in these pictures are students from Georgia State University who are doing a historic structures report in 2018. You can see the Friends of Mimosa at an event, and this is our celebration when the solar roof was approved by by the city. And you'll be hearing more, especially if you follow Friends of Mimosa, about the roof, because we are now finally in the process of actually getting that new solar roof put on, which is going to make Mimosa Hall the oldest net zero building in the country. And that wraps up my presentation. Oops, I'll go to restart so we don't have to. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and I'll take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was great. I learned something more every time. We had more pictures here than I'd seen in the past. So thank you very much for doing all that research.
My pleasure. Where were the enslaved people housed in Roswell? That was a question that I received. Sorry, it looks like it was a direct question to me. So I did want to address that. Okay, Susan, you're still here. Great, thank you. So they were the ones who lived and worked at Mimosa Hall. They would have lived at Mimosa Hall in those 4 slave quarters. There were some other outbuildings too, by the way, a carriage house. I think that's a carriage house and then the 4 slave quarters, but yes, they would have lived in the slave quarters. As for the ones who built the house, that I'm afraid I don't know. And then there was also a question about the 3 women in the middle, which I'm assuming is referring to those Atwood daughters. They wouldn't have been exactly children. They would have been in their teens at the time that that photo was done. And please let me know if you have any other questions. Oh yes, a question about the book at Halloween. So the novel is called Who Killed Aunt Maggie, and it was written by Medora Field Perkerson, and it's a thriller, well not thriller, a cozy mystery. She was inspired by her friend, Margaret Mitchell, and the fame that came with Margaret Mitchell writing Gone with the Wind. And so she decided to write a novel too, and it was a bestseller, and a movie was made the year after that book came out. So the movie was published, or the book was published in 1939, and it's set at Mimosa Hall. It's not called that, it's called Wisteria Hall to protect the privacy of the Tolson family, but it was set at Mimosa Hall, and she said that in talk that she gave when that book came out. And then the movie was released based on that book in 1940. The movie was a flop, but the book was a bestseller, went through several editions. And Kelly lets us know that Who Killed Aunt Maggie is available for purchase at Bullock Hall at Middy's Gift Shop, as it's called, the gift shop at Bullock Hall next door to Mimosa. How many square feet is the house? Now that is a good question. I think it's 7,000. I could be wrong on that though, but ballpark 7,000, unless somebody else chip in, because I think Bullock Hall is 7,000 and Mimosa is a little bit smaller than Bullock Hall in terms of square footage. Okay, I'm not seeing any other, yeah, thank you, Susan. So 7,000 sounds right.
So Sarah, while people are pulling together thoughts and questions, how did you become so interested in these historic houses?
I've always been interested in historic architecture, but I was mostly interested in 17th century. You know, my dissertation is on Cotton Mather. So I had gone to Salem in Massachusetts and was manager of a historic house there. I've always loved historic house museums. And then I came here to get my PhD. And so I kind of looked around for the historic houses, and that brought me to Roswell. And I became a docent at Bullock Hall next door. And so just kind of followed naturally from there that I would go to the sister house, as they call it, since Jane Bullock Dunwoody was the sister of James Bullock, the first owner of Bullock Hall. And so Pat is asking about the enslaved people. That 40 seems like a lot for 9 acres. Yes, and I don't quite understand. Oh, thank you, Simone, for explaining the square footage, 8,000. Okay, so off a little bit. But yeah, so the Bullock family next door also owned about 30 enslaved people. And this is not overlap, we're talking 70 across these two properties. So I'm not sure if Dunwoody owned another property somewhere. I didn't think he did where they were doing labor. To me, it seems like the labor was actually just on the house, maintaining the house and maintaining the property and taking care of it. So not a commercial property, but just a residential property. So looking after some of the gardens and helping keep the house in shape. Things like going hunting to get the food for the white family to eat and taking care of the property. So yeah, it does seem like a lot of people for especially we're looking at only John and Jane, and then maybe 4 of their kids would have been living there since they were older when they moved to the house. So yeah, the black to white ratio is very extreme, but it does show you what large enslavers they were for such a small.
Yeah. So Sarah,
But
I've been told
yeah.
that the property was, most of those enslaved people were working at the mill, and the Kings and the Bullocks and the Hansels leased out their slaves, enslaved people to the mill. And that's really where, because none of these were planting plantations. They were all
Right.
estates, right?
Right.
So most of that help was actually associated to the mill. And they all brought, I know that Roswell King brought in at least 30 slaves to start
Yeah.
the building. And I think the others
Yes.
probably the same, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say, because there was a question from Candace about that. It's possible that they did. I haven't seen any evidence that the Dunwoodies themselves did that, but it is possible that they, and the Bullocks too, because that's a lot of people to look after such a small home. But the mill did also, on its own as an entity, enslave a lot of people too. And I'm not seeing any other questions. Oh, the plans for Mimosa post-pandemic. Well, actually, that's a great time then to turn it back to Mike, who is going to wrap up the talk with some concluding notes. So the first question, great for Mike, is what are the plans for Mimosa Hall post-pandemic?
Oh, that's great. I'm glad to be able to address that. So as some of you that came on early may have heard, we are starting to work on the solar roof this week, and we anticipate having all of that work done by taking off the old roof, doing the measurements, taking off the old roof, doing the base level, and then the solar panels, having all that done by Earth Day, April 22nd. That is our projected date for having the outside of the house, the roof done. The city has has allotted $270,000 for us to get a certificate of occupancy to bring the house up to code. You know, so it was a residential home that was suitable for people to live in, but as it is, it's not suitable for public usage, right? So because of ADA and other concerns, we had to get a lot of work done, and that work starts as soon as the roof is finished, and that includes updating adding a second bathroom on the ground floor, and modernizing both those bathrooms. Doing some work in the kitchen, cleaning up the floors, cleaning up some of the electrical, and that's really and then filling the pool. That's one of the exterior things. So those are the big things that are being done. The city hopes to have the house open, certainly have that construction work all done by late fall, early winter. So we would love to be able to be in the house and in October, November. That is what we're sort of working towards. Um, and some of you may know that we've talked about the house being a meeting place, a place where people come to enjoy art and culture and learn about science and conservation, a place for critical conversations, a place for uh, uh, all sorts of arts and culture. Uh, and that is sort of the programming that we're proposing for the house. The house will be available for rentals for special events, and you'll book all of that through the city. But we're very excited about it. We've already lined up speakers for now and for the rest of the year, and we're expecting to keep that going. Um, Culinary arts is a big part of Roswell, so you'll learn more. You hear more about what we hope to do with the kitchen and build on Roswell's reputation as a culinary arts mecca.
Mike, could I just jump in and say that the city has been a great partner and we have a wonderful, amazing group of people, but there's so much going on that we really do need more volunteers. So if any of you on the call would like to jump in and help us, we've got people who are interested in historic homes, people who are interested in gardening, people who are interested in culinary arts. We've got so much going on, lots of planned. And we need people who like to come to events and maybe just put name tags on people or help us register or things like that. We just always are looking for people to help us do the work of supporting this fabulous home.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Susan. You're absolutely right. I think that we've been able to accomplish a lot with a small group, but we now need a lot more hands, especially as things come closer to opening up the property. And you're absolutely right. If anyone's interested in serving in any capacity, there's lots of work to be done, and we'd love to have you. So please, go to the website or give any of us a call or an email. We'll be glad to talk with you and bring you in. Um, and matter of fact, a number of the people that are on this uh, uh, at this presentation are in our Phoenix Circle. So we thank you for your support. We absolutely appreciate your generosity and we honor the trust you put in us. And we want you to join us and bring friends with you to help and to build us up because we're about the beloved community. Everything that we're doing is to make Roswell a better place, a place that attracts more people, diverse uh, crowds of people that come to learn more and enjoy this hub of hospitality here in North Fulton. So as we say, y'all come. And with that, Steve mentioned the wine tasting that is taking place on the 15th of April. If you go to our website, you'll see a link to join in for that. It's going to be a great time. They're going to give some recipes to do some pairings and that sort of thing. I'm suggesting that you order a bundle for yourself and get a couple of couples to come over to party with you and have those couples buy a bundle so you can go to their house a few weeks later and do the same thing. And there's actually two bundles. There's a white wine bundle and there's a red wine bundle. Although the red wine bundle does have one Sauvignon Blanc in it. And I'm a red wine guy, but I chose the Sauvignon Blanc because it is phenomenal. Very nice and will be great for the spring. You will enjoy it, I'm sure. So please join us. Go to the website, order your bundle or two, order one as a gift. We're fine with that. And have a party, a safe party at your home, and invite your friends to join you and to buy bundles to do the same thing. Anyway, enough commercial, I'm sorry. uh, with that, we have a number of our board members here, and I want to thank them for being here. Our Director of Communications and Operations, Candace Curley, who is the best volunteer in all of Roswell. She gives and gives and gives, and she volunteers for everybody. So we're grateful that she's she's staffed and she's here to help. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking out the time today. Share this with others. We are recording it, so you'll be able to come back and see it. And soon you'll be able to come onto the property and see it live. We look forward to having you there. With that, thank you and have a great night. Be safe, get vaccinated. Thank you all.
Thank you for coming.